environmental governance and the idea of disaster resilience. And I will try to speak nicely about engineers. I admire engineers very much, Stuart, and I will try to clarify, I'll go back to the title, I'll try to clarify why I'm interested in this juxtaposition of community scale resilience and global scale governance. Because I think that there's some real mismatches in the way we think about these issues. So I'm really interested that we've got people from an innovation program, and I sadly only speak English, so I apologise if my English gets some people confused, because we will find, those of you who are native speakers of English, I will confuse you. Because English is such a language that teases the way we think. And it's also a deeply colonising language that insists that we discipline not just our thinking, but the world in particular ways. So I want to undo some of those connections between the way we think and the way the world behaves, and the way that colonialism occupies our heads as well as the landscape. So those of you who are native speakers, prepare for a bumpy ride. Those of you who are relying on Ichin's translate or summary, you're in good hands. Sorry, Ichin. Okay, so we're interested. The course that I'm teaching these, putting these lectures into, is a course on Indigenous community conservation. Can I just have an indication of who's in that course? Who's a student in that course, or are they all left? Oh yes, you are still here. Thank you. So you can see that I'm speaking across a number of lectures. So if something isn't clear, it might be that it's been raised in an earlier lecture, and I apologise to those of you who are here just for one bumpy ride on this roller coaster. Okay, one of the things we know about environmental governance is that it works across multiple scales. There isn't a system of environmental governance. There are complex, overlapping, interacting, conflicting systems of environmental governance. If we start at the top, where lots of big ideas, big proposals for how to organise our responses to environmental crises. Yeah? So the reason we end up with global environmental governance processes is we're dealing with what we might think of an environmental crisis or a climate catastrophe. So because it's a planetary scale, a crisis which is manifested planetary scale, it's a breakdown of planetary systems, that we see these pressures to produce global scale solutions. So those global environmental governance systems include a whole range of key instruments like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Convention on Biological Diversity, the Conference of Parties, all sorts of things. They all get these nice little acronyms that people forget what they stand for and have to go and look at what these acronyms mean. We have organisations. We all know the UN, even though we don't understand what it does or how it does it, or what it doesn't do and why it fails to do them. The IUCN, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, I want to emphasise that word intergovernmental, because what we see embedded right there in that language is that we are dealing with nation states. Yeah? These aren't global at all. These are international, intergovernmental structures. There's a whole range of programs. There's a whole range of agencies that somehow work into these complex systems of environmental governance. But what it's easy to forget when we're negotiating all those interesting and enticing politics of global interaction and global crisis is that the environments being governed in these environmental governance systems are actually places. Places that host webs of relationships, webs of meaning that also stretch across multiple scales. And then multiple spatial, temporal and administrative scales. Now, I'm a geographer. I'm a passionate geographer. I actually think geography matters. But what that means is, I think about places, I think about scales, but I'm also wise enough to recognise that space is just a dimension. So those of you who majored in physics, don't forget that space and time are dimensions. So thinking about spatiality and temporality together, time and space working together, incredibly important when we think about these issues. So how are time and space related to the administrative scales of governance? Yeah? The nation state. In the contemporary world, we just seem to take the nation state for granted. It exists as if it's always existed. And yet for Indigenous groups, the nation state is an entity which has occupied their time and space. Yeah? It's an administrative structure which is alien and possessive. It hasn't learnt to belong to the places that are being governed often. I'd say nearly always. So, the impacts of the decisions that are being made in these global governance systems are also played out through multiple legal and political and administrative jurisdictions. So there are jurisdictional scales being constructed. You will find somewhere to sit, don't be embarrassed. It's a bit crowded. And they're also being interpreted through multiple cultural, historical and scientific lenses. Yeah? So while we might give these governance systems a simple name like the United Nations, we need to understand that these are complex, conflicting systems with particular histories and particular geographies, and that they both reflect and create particular cultural relationships, particular understandings of what it means to govern. Now, in an earlier lecture, I challenged even the notion of governance. Yeah? That if we think that this process of governance is about controlling environments, we end up with solutions to planetary scale crises which are about human intervention, about geoengineering, earth scale engineering of solutions, as if we are in control, we being the human species. Yeah? So we end up with the Anthropocene being amplified as an era of human control, rather than humbly stepping back and saying, gee, we got something wrong a few hundred years ago, let's try and step back from the abyss and rethink what we mean to govern. Can we really manage these systems as if they are a technical system? Yeah? Can we really understand this complexity as if we can play controller? Yeah? And that, I think, is... You can leave now because that's what I want to say. But I'll say it in a bit more detail. So for Indigenous populations, Indigenous groups across the planet, what we know is that their access to, their participation in, their recognition by, and their support from these global environmental governance systems has been highly problematic. It's been limited, it's been restrained, constrained, it's been difficult. Now, it's been difficult for all sorts of reasons. And it's that temporality, that history, and the spatiality, the geography, that we need to come to terms with. Now, one of the problems is that the spaces that are created in these global governance systems are for Indigenous people, as if there's a singular. There's one slot. You can have an Indigenous representative. And yet what we know is that in the places that are being governed, the places to which Indigenous groups belong, there's huge diversity. Yeah? That we can't really simply drop people in to these taken for granted rules-based governing systems that we think will be able to exercise global scale control over environments. As if that recognition of an Indigenous singular opens a space that is equitable, just, sustainable. Yeah? So I want to actually recognise that the complexity we're dealing with creates some real problematics in practical terms. But first of all, I want to get back to scale. As I've said many times, people who know me call me a scale tragic, because once you get the scale lens, you can't unsee it. Yeah? So for most people, scale is a relatively simple hierarchical idea. We can go from the local up through this hierarchy of terms to the global. Yeah? So it usually goes local, regional, national, international, global, maybe planetary, maybe, there's the one, universal. Yeah? So the dominant colonising cultures always think that things are universal, that they always apply everywhere. I want to say that scale is neither simple nor hierarchical. Yeah? So you can't simply stack up all the locals and get the national. You can't simply stack up all the nationals and get the global. Let me give you the really clear example why. Oceans. Yeah? The problem, you don't add all the nations together and get the whole planet, because there are oceans that don't belong to anyone. And yet, we've got UNLOS, the United Nations Law of the Sea. We've got all these assertions of interest. And yet, if you think about Oceania and the small island states of Oceania, where we imagine they're small island states rather than big ocean countries, okay? We have these different imaginaries that put the world together in different ways. So, we can't just add things up to get to the global and then govern them. We need to think about relationalities, about entanglements. So when we say that these environmental governance systems stretch across multiple spatial, temporal, and administrative scales, we do need to unpack that. We need to understand this complexity. Geographers, and hands up who thinks of themselves as a geographer. I do. Okay, you're welcome, Professor Shen. Nobody else thinks of themselves as a geographer. Oh, goodness me, who am I talking to? Okay, geographers, like Professor Shen and I, like to draw up lines on maps, and with GIS technologies, we seem to be able to draw increasingly precise lines on maps, as if they're really there. Now, who else likes to draw lines on maps? Nation states, yeah, they're called boundaries. Colonisers, they're called frontiers. Yeah? How do we begin to imagine these lines on map? Well, geographers also talk about boundary work, working around the edges of big ideas, working around the edges of spaces, of territories, understanding the overlap. So ecologists talk about edges, ecological edges, where ecosystems overlap, where you get this enormous biodiversity, where you get influences from multiple spaces. Now, if we had a world that was organised around edges rather than borders, if we understood connection rather than separation, we would think about governance very differently. And that's what I want to talk about in terms of scale. That scale is about relationships between things. So the relationships between places that interact produces larger scale places. They're still places. They're still systems of connection. But the coloniser constructs the scales at which power can be exercised, and that solutions, governance, can be imposed to reflect existing patterns of power. Yeah? So whatever we do, whatever innovations I'll use that word since I've got this innovations audience today, whatever innovations in governance, in the technologies of governance we might produce, they are innovations that reflect, amplify and reinforce the existing patterns of privilege and power. Yeah? Otherwise, they wouldn't get recognised by those existing patterns of privilege and power. So, what happens is that those patterns erase, deny, forget the histories of conquest, dispossession, genocide and theft that characterise the experience of colonisation. Often those patterns of power celebrate the facts of colonisation. They celebrate the arrival of modernity in the shape of the coloniser, as if that is the solution. And they have all sorts of theological, political, cultural justifications that often arise around ideas of race and destiny, God's chosen people, superiority. None of which convince me personally, and I think probably shouldn't convince anybody who isn't on the winning side. So in this way, governance, whether it's local, institutional, this is an institution, we have institutional governance in every university, so I'm talking about that as a scale of governance. Regional, in the form of council, local council governance and so on. National, corporate governance, imperial governance, global governance. Those structures all belong to those who already govern. They're very rarely challenged by innovations because of the exercise of power. So for those who don't govern, for those who struggle to even be recognised as existing, whether we're talking about human communities or more than human communities, participation in those systems of governance risks further entrenching the patterns of colonisation and loss of autonomy. And so we have a right to self-determination, a right to self-government, which is entrenched in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which I started this lecture series with. And yet, to try and exercise self-determination or self-government becomes a threat to those very systems of governance that are supposed to be guaranteeing those rights. Because if you exercise self-governance, you become a threat to somebody else's sovereignty. So if Indigenous people genuinely exercise self-governance, they dissemble in some way or another the colonised version of governance. So this is really complex social, political, diplomatic. Did I hear somebody's here from in diplomatic circles? Diplomacy is such an interesting thing because somehow we have these imagined government-to-government relations that very undiplomatically suppress identity, culture, language, possibility, innovation. Yeah. So, the right place there. Is that okay, the right place? No, I went too far. So I'm trying to problematise the idea of governance itself, about how we, with Indigenous populations, how we might even begin to imagine the exercise of autonomy, self-governance, without it being subsumed by the frameworks of colonisation, the disciplines of colonial study. Yeah? I said a few times that I've never studied Indigenous peoples. I've worked for and with rather than on Indigenous populations. I'm a servant of people in place, not a servant of... I'm a passionate geographer, but I don't serve the discipline as a colonising discipline. Geography was colonising discipline extraordinaire. We were sent out by the colonial imperial authorities to document the resources, the environments, the people, so that the coloniser could do their job. So we, geographers, have an obligation to decolonise, to unthink the way that our discipline has been constructed. So my colleague, my Torres Strait Islander colleague in Australia, Martin Nakata, wrote a fantastic book about that whole relationship, about academic disciplines and the way that disciplined thinking in university and academic disciplines was disciplining the savages, and that now is the time to savage the disciplines, yeah? To really challenge the way we think about academic knowledge. So I'm quite happy for us to challenge, to critique those ways that try to fit everything into a categorical box and to begin listening rather than speaking all the time. So in these governance systems, just being recognised, let alone understood, by local and national structures that have produced the histories and geographies of colonisation is an important step for Indigenous peoples. Securing presence, recognition and a capacity or an opportunity to influence those systems of global environmental governance is certainly a priority, but it's not risk-free. Now, Melanie Zerber's work, so she's a colleague that I work with in Canada. She's done great work looking at the barriers to Indigenous participation in these global environmental governance structures. Cost, complexity, language, time, distance, representation, gender, class, knowledge, capacity limits. And particularly, what we've talked about is the intercultural capacity deficits of the main institutional players. Yeah? They don't have the capacity, the competence that's required to work in these intercultural settings. And yet, the capacity building is always offered to Indigenous peoples, to local communities, as if they don't have the capacity that these systems need. There is no reflection on what we, the global players, don't have. There's always an insistence that the others don't have capacity to work with us. Yeah? We never transform, we never question the structures of power and privilege. So I often insist others think about capacity deficits in those structures that we're working in, rather than insist on the deficits being in the Indigenous communities. That those barriers have affected the power of Indigenous participants to influence the development and the implementation of many of those governance structures, programs, policies, institutions. And it's affected it at many scales. So whether we're working at the local scale of a conservation reserve in which the governance structure says the key decision makers are the state agencies. Yeah? So in Indigenous community conservation, we often emphasise joint management, co-management. The language changes. What we don't see is Indigenous management, Indigenous governance, self-government. And yet there's a right entrenched right there in the UN Declaration that says you've got a right to self-government, a right to self-determination. But you can only exercise that right if the nation state tells you it's okay. You can only exercise that right in partnership with the coloniser. So it's complicated political, diplomatic work that needs to be done. So, given the tensions between many First Nations and colonial settler states, that in terms of governing their own traditional territory, it's hardly surprising that it's the state parties to those conventions and agreements and international treaties that are often hostile to Indigenous people's presence in these environmental governance forums. So, let me get to disaster. And Professor Shan's got her students here because they want to witness a disaster in presentation. I hope I don't cause a disaster. So, how do we imagine disasters? Who imagines that the word disaster sits comfortably with the word natural? So we talk about natural disasters. This is actually a question. I know that I'm supposed to just speak and not ask. But who thinks natural disasters are natural? Well, gee, you're advanced thinkers. Nobody does anymore. In fact, if we look at the paper from Nature in 1976, there is this whole critique of that terminology of natural disasters, where the distinction between natural hazards and what turns them into disasters is the interface between social and environmental systems, if you like, between people and the context that they live in. So, the notion that we should be able to control natural disasters, that we should be able to exercise management in these settings, I've already tried to tackle that by thinking about the weaknesses of those conceptual building blocks, to thinking about our relationships between social and environmental systems, between human and natural systems. If we're genuinely entangled, we shouldn't be pulling those things apart quite so carelessly. As I've said already, in ecological science and Indigenous science, Indigenous wisdom, reinforce the idea that complex systems with thick edges, big overlaps, rich species and nutrient diversity, multiple niches, compatible and collaborative communities, those are resilient systems. Those are resilient places capable of adapting, capable of responding to changing circumstances, whether those circumstances are changing over short or long time cycles, and capable of creating relational webs that support survival, renewal and adaptation. Many of the environmental governance systems get the ecological version of resilience, but have great difficulty in understanding that notion of human resilience. It's a word that gets used over and over again in disaster settings about we want to build resilience, we're a resilient community, we will recover, we will come back from this. But the way that disasters are often framed as rapid onset things hides many of the systems that undermine resilience, that undermine social and community resilience, because they hide what my colleagues and I have talked about as the unnatural disaster of colonisation. Yeah? This process that routinely pulls away the capacity of communities and societies to exercise self-governance, to exercise self-protection, to maintain the balance between themselves and their place, yeah? To act responsibly in place. So that means that we end up making those slow catastrophes of colonisation, climate change, extinction, diffused hardships like poverty, discrimination, dispossession. Those things become really hard to frame as demanding attention in relation to building resilience and overcoming vulnerability to high impact disasters. Things like earthquakes, typhoons, floods, tsunamis and the like. And that we need to begin to think about what's that interplay? How do we in fact build resilience, overcome vulnerability, which is a product of the way our systems work, our colonising, decolonising systems work. And one of the ways that I think we see this is in disaster responsiveness, in the idea of building back better. So that insistence, and it was articulated particularly in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami, Typhoon Morakot here in Taiwan, and the Tohoku earthquake tsunami in Japan. This notion that we will build back better, implying that we will build in to the way we respond more resilience and less vulnerability to repeat disasters. Now, what we see in disaster response is often the need for speed. But the need for speed is accompanied by the need to reduce costs and to respond to a whole lot of political pressures, which often don't get talked about, but reflect corruption, self-interest, misinformation, and that those political constraints often are precisely what's in control of the capacity of a society to respond to disaster. So it's those who are already in power who get to define what is better. So in designing Build Back Better solutions, better looks like often more of the same, more efficient business as usual for the coloniser. So what we see is that building back better will often place people into some people into harm's way. And guess who gets put into harm's way? It's not the privileged. It's not the rich and powerful. It's the already vulnerable. It's the already marginalised, the already pauperised, the already dispossessed. And it's those people who are often seen as the victims of disaster who become voiceless in responding to this Build Back Better ideology. So if existing systems of governance already have structures of discrimination built into them, into the patterns of what constitutes property, property that deserves to be compensated, what constitutes an interest of a valuable entity. If it has those patterns of discrimination built into representation, into recognition, into opportunity, into access, then what gets defined as better in the post-disaster situation is easily skewed to favour the already rich and powerful. So for colonised people, disaster reconstruction, disaster recovery can often simply become a new phase of disaster. And a phase which continues the pre-disaster catastrophe of poverty, dispossession, colonisation. So, at the beginning of my intervention into this lecture series, I raised some questions about expertise and my cynicism about expertise. And what we see in environmental governance systems is that these are often highly expert-focused, expert-centric systems of governance. So one of the questions that I'd like people to think about is, who knows about disasters? Who speaks? Who listens? And who responds? Because one of the things, my observation is that no matter how often and how loudly some victim groups speak, they're not heard. These systems aren't particularly responsive because they are expert-focused systems, and expertise becomes decisive, and expertise is often defined as technical expertise. So that this notion of entanglement that I've worked with in these lectures is not at the forefront of thinking about what it means to build resilience and to build out future vulnerabilities. So we need to overcome these systems which produce notions of resilience as business as usual, but better. Notions that imagine the same patterns of privilege, power and abuse, but with a least cost model, a lower cost model. We who have access to university education and the voice and the opportunities that gives us need to be a bit less self-important. We need to recognise that we need to be accountable. That it's not just others that need to be accountable. we need to hold ourselves ready to be held accountable. And we shouldn't imagine our expertise is context-free, that it's not entangled in those systems of power and privilege that are part of the problem. So we shouldn't ever imagine that we mightn't be part of the problem as well. So we need to learn to listen. We need to recognise that disaster recovery itself can often be decolonising. Minashu, in talking about Typhoon Morakot, concluded that, like the colonial shaping and reshaping of peoples and their places, post-disaster practices can be a means by which external visions, rather than those of affected people, are implemented in order to build back better. And she demonstrated how well-intended disaster relief can quickly become deeply colonising in its effect, and how expert forces, values and ambitions can overwhelm, compromise and weaken the ability of those in pre-disaster communities to build resilience and overcome vulnerabilities in ways that build back better in terms that are locally referenced. She points to the complicated array of terms in Chinese that get translated into English as community in administrative, cultural, political terms. And the way that they're imposed on tribal, social, cultural relations during recovery. And as one of her respondents said, in reconstruction, everyone's human first, yeah? So we just deal with people. We don't put culture, history and geography into how we deal with people. We deal with a common humanity. What's disguised in that is the pre-existing coloniality of the way some humans are treated. So, we have a set of images here that I just wanted to confront you with as students to start with. To think about, in English we have this notion that seeing is believing. As positivists, we're all looking for evidence. We want evidence about what we do. Okay, what's the picture on this picture? What's represented in that image? Who sees an old lady? Who sees a young lady? Wow, who sees both? Oh, champion. Forest or tree? Is this one tree, many tree? This is an Australian painting, so I don't, it's a different forest, it's a different context for me. Because this is a scale question here, yeah? Because if you know Australian trees, this could either be multiple trunks of trees looking through a forest, or it could just be one, because of the way the patterns have formed in bark. And so finally I come to the central image, which is a fantastic landscape painting by William Robinson, Australian landscape painter. What's unusual about this landscape painting? From a Western point of view, landscapes always have horizons. This guy is lying on the ground in a mountain forest, looking up. He's engaging with the landscape in an entirely different way. He's put a different lens, a different positionality in that system that we would commonly imagine as taking a horizontal view of landscape. And so, all I want to say with these three images is never take anything for granted. Never assume that your positionality gives you an entitlement to know what you're looking at. Sometimes you have to allow yourself to listen to what others are saying in order to understand both what the problem and what the solutions might be. And in the context of environmental governance, there are a lot of loud voices telling us both what the problems and the solutions are. And there is a lot of silencing of diverse voices that perhaps have some longer wisdom to draw. Thank you.
好，那对我还是希望其实可以把时间尽量留给大家最后发问了，那所以我还是就是简单的，好，简单的把老师刚刚讲的一些大概念再重复一下。那其实有一些概念在前面的几堂课的时候都已经有提过，那我觉得它就是一个在几次的课堂下来，它其实一直不断去强调为什么这些概念是重要的。那一开始他就先提到说，其实这个语言的使用它现在是用英文，那我现在也是用中文，但其实语言使用它其实就是一个非常殖民的工具啊。它在语言的背后，其实代表是很多就是殖民的思想跟这个世界应该要运作的方式。那其实它已经界定了我们某些的思想跟行为，所以他就讲说，他其实今天可能用了很多，虽然是在讲英文，但是其实大家会听得很不飒飒，因为其实他就是想要去拆解这些文字概念背后的意义是什么。那进入到环境治理的这个讨论呢，它其实就先提的就是说，其实这个世上没有一个特定的环境治理的系统，有非常多共同存在的环境治理系统。那有时候这些环境治理系统其实之间是互相抵触的哈。不过我们就是在谈到全球的环境治理的时候，我们好像去期待说可以有一个全球尺度的解决问题的一个方法。那这个其实是有一些问题的。那这全球环境治理的解决方法有什么？其实我们已经很多耳熟能详的一些用词啦，比如像 SDG 啊，然后什么生物多样性公约啊、COP 啊这些，甚至我们常运用这些名词，运用到我们搞不好都已经忘记它背后真正的意涵是什么了，这样子。那他在这个部分，他去提醒，其实我们所谓在谈的这个全球，就是一个 global governance，global environmental governance， 其实它是一个 intergovernmental， 其实它是在谈国家之间，它不是真的在讲一个全球的东西，因为其实还是以国家为基本单位来去谈这个我们怎么以国家为基本单位来做环境的治理这样。好，然后再来是其实他前面几次的演讲，他也已经去挑战了这个治理的概念。就是目前其实，在殖民系统下面的治理概念，基本上还是借由一些介入或者是一些计划来去做控制。那这个前设是觉得我们有能力控制自然环境，然后而不是说譬如说像在面对在遇到灾难或灾害的时候，我们会去退一步想说，我们做错了什么？我们过去做错了什么？我们需要重新调整的是什么？我们基本上现在的方式还是觉得，好，那这件事情发生，我们就要来控制这件事情，让它不要再发生，或者是减少它对我们的生活的影响。那可是原住民在这个全球环境治理的系统里面，一直是很难取得进入的途径，或者去参与其中，甚至是被这些环境治理系统所认可跟支持。然后在这样的全球环境治理系统里面，其实基本上原住民还是被视为是一个同质的群体。可是我们其实都知道，原住民之间存在非常大的歧义，彼此之间有非常大的不同的差异，所以其实很难将这样子的全球治理系统去套用在原住民群体身上所以其实这个系统还是有它的很多问题跟值得我们思考的部分存在。那再来是我们好像常常也就是想象说这样子的我们在全球面临的一些挑战跟我们需要的解决方案，可以在这样子全球的治理系统里面去找到。不过，其实这样的治理系统，它就是在强调说，其实这个主流的殖民思想，这个背后还是主流殖民思想里面一个想要好像建立一套可以套用在所有不同情境的管理方式。但是它其实从第一堂到现在，它一直在强调的是，我们其实是要去思考那个关联性、关系性，就 relationality， 而不是觉得说可以有一个普通的东西放在所有的事情上面都可以获得问题的解决。然后所以他其实在2001年的时候，他其实有写一篇文章去讨论，他说因为其实地理学家很喜欢画那个地图，很喜欢画线，去界定某些范畴。那他其实讲到这个 relationality 这个关系性的东西的时候，他就在2001年的时候，他其实去强调这篇文章就去强调说，其实像生态系统是在谈 ages， 就是那个 ages 是在讲生态系之间互相重叠的地方。 那如果我们是不是可以把这样的概念来去重新思考，就是放在地理学去思考，不是去思考边界，而去思考就是这个重叠的关系，或者是彼此互相的关系是什么？那这样我们对于治理的想象会变得非常的不一样。那再来就是他就是提到说，其实殖民者建构的这些尺度，基本上是让他们可以去在其中行使他们的权利。甚至是强加一些解决方案在里面。那有时候这些解决方案好像看起来是一个创新的方法，可是它基本上背后还是去反映了现有的权力模式。那这样的权力模式目的就是要去否认、隐藏或者遗忘这些殖民者他征服、剥夺跟偷窃，还有进行种族灭绝的一些殖民历史。那这些模式常常其实是欢迎殖民的，是欢迎现代性的，就是去更促成这个殖民的一些体制这样。那可是对于那些没有在这个治理系统或者没有这样子治理权利的人，或者是非人类来说，其实如果他被某种形式的让他参与在这样子的治理体系里面，其实是可能巩固强化了那些已经本来就限制他们自治跟自觉的殖民模式。那就提到说，其实我们现在已经有原住民族联合国原住民族权利宣言在他第一堂的时候，他其实最开头就是先谈这个部分。可是其实在当初签署的有签署这个 UNFCCC 的这些国家，他们其实在 UNFCCC 里面其实是去保障了原住民的自治自觉权。可是这些国家来讲，真正实行的时候，如果真的原住民要去行使自治自觉权的时候，原住民族都变成这些国家最大的威胁，因为这就对他们来讲是威胁到了那个国家的完整性，这样 integrity 这样子。然后所以这是一个相当矛盾的状况。所以他就也问大家说，我们其实去提醒大家说，我们要开始想象自治自觉可以怎么样去进行。像他就以他自己为例来讲，他其实永远都在他自我介绍的时候，他永远都在强调说，他不是做原住民的研究，他是跟原住民一起，然后也为了原住民去做研究，就是 work on 不是 work on indigenous people， 是 work with and work for indigenous people。那他虽然就自认为是一个地理学者，可是他在这个地理学的领域，他并不无误于这个殖民的体系。他是希望使用这个学科来做研究，但是并不是要运用地理学科来去服务于殖民体制，反而是可能要去挑战这个这个体制的这样。然后那再来就是说，我们去思考说怎么把原住民放在参与到原住民全球的环境治理体系的时候，其实这是一件非常重要的事情，就我们要开始去思考怎么让原住民参与在这个全球的环境治理系统。但这件事情其实并不是那么容易，而且甚至存在有时候是存在一些风险的哈。那他就用了这个有一篇研究就去提到说，其实要让原住民参与在全球的环境治理系统里面的时候，有面对到许多的困难跟障碍。那这些困难跟障碍里面，他特别点出来的一点就是这些国际机构之间他们跨文化学习能力的不足。然后甚至说，国家我们其实现在常听到就是 capacity building 这个名词，就是好像假设说，都是原住民，他们没有能力去学习，他们没有能力，所以他们必须要去，他们是那个需要去做能力建构的人，而不会去提到说国家系统其实才是文化学习能力、跨文化学习能力不够的人，而需要做一些能力的建构这样子。好，所以所以那其实因为国家政府就刚刚提到的这个紧张，就是原住民族其实常跟国家政府之间存在的一些紧张关系就是刚刚提到这个自治自觉对国家的威胁。所以其实国家政府通常对于在这种环境治理的论坛里面，它对原住民的存在跟发言，它其实常常是充满敌意的。那重点就是说，这个关键的决策治理权还是必须要是掌握在国家的手上。所以现在我们在谈环境治理的时候，如果即便有把原住民容纳进来，我们谈的也只是共管或联合管理，而不是说就是交给原住民管理。因为原住民只能在跟国家建立一个伙伴关系的前提下去行使他们的管理权，而没有办法全权的去拥有这个管理权这样。那再来就是他提到的这个 resilience 的这个概念这个复原或者是我们在讲韧性这样。那他就讲到说，其实很多的环境治理跟管理系统其实已经都去认可了自然系统、自然系统它内部其实是有它的韧性跟复原力的。 可是却好像很难去把这样子的观点也接受或套用在人类系统的观察上面。我们通常就是，其实刚刚他就有问说，还有谁认为说，灾难是自然的？然后我想大家其实现在都已经开始接受这个观点，就是说，其实灾难它并不是完全自然的哈。虽然这边其实就有一个是 disaster， 一个是 hazard， 就是我们会有灾害，但是灾害它是不是真的会成为人类的灾难？其实这两件事情是有所分别跟差异的。那通常灾害会变成灾害，其实常常是因为治理系统。他把就是国家的治理的方式，他把人群置于危险之中，所以才会让灾害变成灾难。那这些人又常常是一些比较弱势的，就是比较易受伤的、比较 vulnerable 的这些社群这样。那再来另外一个部分就是说，通常我们现在在界定的灾害哈，其实都是一个比较急速发生的，譬如说像台风啊、地震啊、洪水、海啸这些。可是其实我们也有一些比较在缓慢的时间尺度上一直在发生的一些灾难，譬如说殖民啊，譬如说气候变迁啊、物种灭绝，然后甚至像贫困啊、歧视啊、剥夺这样的东西，好像在这些东西其实它也是一个灾难。可是这个东西比较没有被我们现在就是主流的灾难的论述里面来做讨论这样。那通常政府在面对灾难的反应呢，它就是他们的概念，大概就是他讲的这个 build back better 哈。我不确定这中文要怎么翻译会比较适合，但是可能就有点说重建一个更美好的未来。它是重建，可是这个目的又是要迈向一个更好的一个未来这样。那希望说可以借由建立更强的韧性或更低的脆弱性来避免灾难的再次发生。可是他这边就问大家说，可是通常是谁来决定什么是 better， 什么是更好的未来？那通常这个都是这些本来就已经掌握权势的人在决定的，所以他们定义的这个更好的未来，其实目的是要让他们可以继续去掌控权力。那这样子的解决方案呢，对于那些已经被排除在边缘的人来讲，其实可能是更加让情况更加的恶化。也就是说，其实灾害重建可能会对于他们来讲变成了另一个阶段的新的灾难。好，然后再来最后就是他又回到其实一样，从第一堂啊就对大家提问，就是到底谁是专家，或者是什么是专家？因为其实尤其是灾害重建的过程，其实是非常的强调专业取向的，就是我们都是找这些工程师啊或什么的，就是好像所谓的专业人士来去决定要怎么去做重建工作。但是他想问大家去思考说，在这个灾难的过程里面，其实谁真的知道在地的环境是什么，或者是灾难是怎么发生？那通常在这个重建的过程里面，又通常是谁有发言的权利？那是有谁在真正做到倾听？然后又是谁在做回应这些问题？这样。那这个部分，他其实就去谈到说，其实很多在做环境治理的人，通常都会有一种自我的重要性。那个自我重要性是认为他们觉得除了他们之外的人都要负责任，就是这个责任是属于别人的。可是他在今天的演讲去提醒我们，大家都要去思考说，其实或许我们每一个人都必须要负责任，因为我们都很有可能是成为创造问题的一个其中的一份子，而不是可以完全置身事外的这样。好，然后再来就是他其实去提到了用了台湾的例子，就是莫拉克风灾的例子。那他的一个学生徐敏娜，他其实在做南部的莫拉克风灾后重建的研究，它里面就有提到说，其实像殖民主义它的灾后的这个工作，其实可以通常是实践外来的愿景。那这些外来的愿景常常就是外来的人的愿景，然后这个外来人的愿景常常就是这个殖民系统下面的一些愿景这样，而不是真的当地受这个灾难影响的他们的愿景这样，就是这个灾后的重建变成是这样子的一个手段。那再来是这个灾后救援，灾后重建或者灾后救援，它其实虽然是一个善意，但是它也可能会变成另外一种形式的殖民，然后。专家力量啊，或者是价值观跟他们的企图心，其实某种程度都压倒、损害跟剥削了当地社区他们自己的需求这样。 那他就是在他的研究里面，其实他有引用了一个他就是 NGO 的受访者的话，他就说在重建里面，我们其实就是首先我们必须只是一个人类，意思就是说，我们在灾后重建对待社区的方式，只是把大家都视为是同等样的人，我们不会去将这些不同的群体背后的文化历史跟地理的脉络考量进来。那所以其实这个就是跟过去的殖民的过程其实非常相像，就是把人都视为是同等的，没有它背后的脉络需要去考虑这样。好，然后最后就是他放的那张图啦，那其实他有稍微解释了一下。不过其实这张图它的其实对就是今天的总结的一个提醒大家，就是说我们必须要去了解问题跟解决方法，我们真的要花时间去了解问题是怎么发生的，还有它解决方法要怎么做出来这样。因为在环境治理系统里面，其实有很多声音在告诉，好像很多来自专家的声音都在告诉我们说，我们应该要做什么，我们应该要怎么做。可是其实同时也有很多被消音的声音。那或许很多的智慧其实是存在于这些被消音的声音里面，所以我们更需要花一些力气或者花一些时间去倾听这些声音。好，那这是大概今天的摘要。
接下来我们特别今天